A peaceful hike in the woods spirals into a nightmare for two friends who stumble upon something far darker than they ever imagined. Masks hang from trees, eerie whispers echo through the woods, and something sinister watches them from the shadows. In this extended episode of Nightmare Narratives, brace yourself for a tale of terror that will pull you deeper into the darkness. The day started off like any other. The air was cool, the sky a muted gray, and a light breeze rustled through the trees as we drove toward the trailhead. Daniel had been talking about this hike for weeks, excited to escape the city and explore the more isolated parts of the forest. The trail he'd found was deep in the woods, far from the usual crowded hiking spots, promising the solitude we craved. But as soon as we pulled into the empty parking lot, that sense of unease crept over me like a cold hand on the back of my neck. The forest loomed ahead dark and still, the trees standing like silent sentinels. No other cars were in the lot, no people, no sound of distant voices, no sign of life, just an overwhelming silence that pressed down on us, heavier than I expected. I glanced at Daniel, but he didn't seem to notice. He was already slinging his backpack over his shoulder, grinning from ear to ear. "Ready for this?" he asked, his voice full of excitement. I forced a smile and nodded, though my gut told me something wasn't right. The air felt wrong, too still, too quiet, but I brushed off the thought, attributing it to nerves. After all, we were here to get away, to clear our heads. I couldn't let a little paranoia ruin that. We set off down the trail, our boots crunching softly on the gravel path. For the first mile or so, everything seemed fine. The trail was well marked, winding gently through the woods, and the canopy overhead was thick enough to block most of the sunlight, casting the forest floor in long shadows. The sound of our footsteps was the only thing breaking the quiet, and for a while it felt peaceful, exactly what we had hoped for. But as we walked deeper into the woods, the atmosphere began to change. The trees seemed to grow taller, their trunks darker and more twisted. The trail narrowed, becoming overgrown with underbrush and tangled roots that seemed to grab at our feet. The further we went, the darker the forest became, as if the light from the sky couldn't penetrate the thick canopy above. The air grew colder, and with every step, the silence seemed to deepen, becoming almost oppressive. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the darkness or the cold. It was the way the forest felt, like it was alive, like it was watching us, waiting. That's when Daniel spotted the first mask. "Do you see that?" he asked, slowing his pace. I followed his gaze and felt a chill crawl down my spine. There, hanging from a low branch just off the trail, was a mask. A cheap plastic mask, the kind you'd find in a Halloween store, with hollow eyes and a blank, expressionless face. It swayed gently in the breeze, as if it had been waiting for us to find it. "What the hell?" I muttered, stepping closer. Daniel pulled the mask down from the branch, turning it over in his hands. As he did, a folded piece of paper slipped out from behind it, fluttering to the ground. He picked it up, his brow furrowing as he unfolded the note. "Follow the masks." A shiver ran down my spine, and I instinctively took a step back, glancing around the woods. The silence around us suddenly felt heavier, more suffocating. "We should go back," I said, my voice trembling slightly. But Daniel grinned, the same reckless grin he always wore when he was about to do something stupid. "Come on, it's probably just some kids messing around. Let's see where it leads." I wanted to argue, to tell him that this was a terrible idea. but I didn't. Instead, I followed him deeper into the woods, my heart pounding with every step. If you're starting to feel the creeping tension, don't forget to like and share this video. We're only at the beginning, and things are about to get a whole lot darker. The deeper we went, the more unsettling the forest became. The path, once clear and easy to follow, was now almost swallowed by thick undergrowth and creeping vines. The trees themselves seemed to twist and contort, their branches forming a dark canopy that blotted out most of the light. Every now and then, we would come across another mask hanging from a tree or nailed to a trunk, its hollow eyes watching us as we passed. Each mask was different. Some were plastic, some were wooden, and others looked like they were carved from stone, their features crude and grotesque. With every mask we found, there was another note, each one more cryptic and ominous than the last. "You're getting closer." He's watching. You cannot turn back. I felt the chill in the air grow colder with each step, the silence pressing in on me like a physical weight. It was as if the forest had swallowed all sound, leaving only the faint rustle of the trees and the crunch of leaves beneath our boots. The sense of being watched grew stronger with every passing minute, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more and more frequently, convinced that we were not alone. "Daniel, we need to go back," I said again, my voice shaking. But Daniel was focused, his eyes wide and unblinking, his pace quickening as if he were being pulled forward by some unseen force. "We're almost there," he muttered, his voice distant. "Almost where?" I demanded, frustration and fear bubbling up inside me. "Where are we going?" But he didn't answer. He just kept walking, his steps growing more hurried, more frantic. I followed him, my heart racing, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps as the feeling of dread deepened. The forest had changed. The once wide trail was now nothing more than a narrow path through the trees, and the masks had become more frequent, hanging from every branch, every tree, their hollow eyes watching us. Some of the masks were smiling, others had twisted, agonized expressions, and a few were completely blank, their faces void of any features at all. And the notes, they kept coming. "He knows you're here. It's too late. You cannot escape." I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced at Daniel, but he didn't seem to notice the growing darkness, the creeping terror that had taken hold of me. He was too focused, too entranced by whatever lay ahead. And then, we saw it? A cabin. It stood in the middle of a small clearing, its wooden walls dark and rotting, the windows shattered and covered in grime. The roof sagged and the door hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze. The sight of it sent a wave of cold terror through me. "We shouldn't go in there," I whispered, my voice trembling. But Daniel was already moving toward the cabin, his steps slow and deliberate, like he was being drawn toward it by some invisible force. "Daniel, wait," I called after him, panic rising in my chest. "This is a really bad idea." He didn't respond. He disappeared into the cabin without a second thought, leaving me standing at the edge of the clearing, frozen by fear and indecision. For a moment, I stood there, my heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn around, to run as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't leave him. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and stepped toward the cabin. What would you do if you found yourself standing at the edge of a haunted cabin in the middle of nowhere. Comment below and share your thoughts. If you've ever had an eerie encounter in the woods, we'd love to hear it. The air inside the cabin was thick with the stench of decay. The floor creaked beneath my weight, and the walls were covered in black mold, creeping up from the corners like some dark, living force. The light from outside barely penetrated the room, casting everything in deep shadow. "Daniel?" I called, my voice shaky as I stepped further inside. The silence was suffocating. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and shallow, echoing in the small space. I took a few steps forward, my heart pounding in my chest, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of Daniel. And then I saw him. Daniel stood in the center of the room, his back to me, his body rigid and motionless. He was staring down at something on the floor, his hands hanging limply at his sides. "Daniel?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. He didn't move. I took a few cautious steps closer, my breath catching in my throat. As I approached, I could see what he was looking at, a mask. But this one was different from the others. It wasn't made of plastic or wood. It was made of bone. The surface was rough and jagged, and it was covered in something dark, something that looked like dried blood. The eyes weren't hollow anymore. They were filled with something dark and swirling like ink suspended in water, and they were staring right at me. A cold wave of terror washed over me, and I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. The air around me grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift, twisting and writhing like something alive. "Daniel, we need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "Now." But he didn't move. He didn't even blink. His eyes were locked on the mask, his face pale and expressionless. Then, slowly, he turned to look at me. His eyes were dark, almost black, and his lips curled into a twisted, unnatural smile. "He's here," Daniel whispered, his voice low and guttural. Before I could react, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath hanging in the air, cold and pale, as the shadows deepened around us. The whispers started again, louder this time, more insistent. They seemed to come from every direction, echoing through the cabin like a chorus of voices, each one overlapping the other. And then I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, whispering from the darkness, "Join us." If this story has kept you on edge, make sure to subscribe to Nightmare Narratives and hit the notification bell so you never miss another terrifying tale. The nightmare has only just begun.